who's been a champion of housing in Berkeley and across the region as ABAG president. Mayor Arreguín, were you ever an East Bay Young Democrat? One moment.
Thank you. Yes, I was a longtime member of the East Bay Young Democrats, and I am a relatively young Democrat as I aged out a couple of years ago, but was actually a member of the club from the very beginning in 2004, and just really appreciate all the work that EBYD does every year, not just to get progressive Democrats elected, but to advocate for the issues important to young people in East Bay.
Awesome, really appreciate it, and thank you for your work setting up, any of the work that we do this year. Pay it forward. Thank you. Next up, want to introduce Xiomara Cisneros, a member of the Alameda Planning Board. Works professionally with CZI, is a board member of the Housing Action Coalition, and throughout her professional career has spent her professional career working on housing issues of all sorts. Currently, obviously, a resident of Alameda. Thank you for representing the island. Next, we have Councilmember John Wizard, who is a council member in Seaside, maybe not super familiar to those of us in the East Bay, but has represented a strong pro-housing voice in Seaside and was a founding member of the Campaign for Fair Housing Elements, a group that's I will let you describe, but I would describe as a coalition of folks working extremely hard to make sure we are creating and then implementing, doing the hard work of implementing strong housing elements. Is that fair, Councilmember Wizard?
Very fair,
Awesome.
Nico.
Great. Well, so let's get into it. First question up. I just want to start, I think, housing elements have been described as the most important California process that no one knows about. And so I want to pose the question to each of you in very short, basic terms. What is a housing element? Whoever wants to take it first, I leave it to you.
Well, I'm happy to kick things off. So, and maybe Councilmember Wizard can elaborate. As in addition to his role as an elected official, he's definitely an expert on issues of housing elements and implementation of state housing law, and hopefully soon a state assembly member. But every 8 years, the state of California requires that local jurisdictions, counties and cities have to update their housing elements of their general plans. The general plan is really the sort of the overarching land use plan for each jurisdiction. And so there are various elements, whether it may be their housing element, their land use element, their public safety element. And so as part of the process of updating housing elements, local governments must plan for their regional housing need. And so every 8 years, the state of California issues what's called the Regional Housing Needs Determination, which is a number that they assign to each region in the state of California. And in the San Francisco Bay Area, they assign that number to the Association of Bay Area Governments, or Regional Council of Governments, which I serve as president of. And our responsibility is to determine a formula for how to distribute that housing need to every town, city, and county in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so we actually just completed our Regional Housing Needs Allocation process. And this time, for what's called the 6th cycle of the Regional Housing Needs Allocation, we've had to plan for 441,000 units in the San Francisco Bay Area. And so ABAG, working with many stakeholders, local government officials, people from the business, housing, environment, equity sectors, have worked with ABAG to develop a formula for how to equitably distribute that housing need throughout the San Francisco Bay Area. And in my city of Berkeley, we have to plan for close to 9,000 new units of housing in my community. In addition, typically local governments have to rezone sites in order to accommodate the housing need. And so every jurisdiction, whether it's counties or cities in San Francisco Bay Area, are in the process of identifying sites in their communities where they can accommodate new housing, potentially rezoning sites to accommodate more housing, and also developing the plans and programs that are going to be the foundation of their housing elements. So at the core, it's a plan for how each local government is not just going to meet its regional housing need, but also how it's going to address the housing needs of each community over that 8-year cycle. And the state HCD, Housing and Community Development, has to approve our housing elements and is monitoring the progress of implementing those housing elements, including how many building permits we've issued over that 8-year cycle. And depending on the level of compliance with achieving our regional housing needs allocation, certain state laws may trigger. So I'll leave it there, but that's kind of at a high level what the housing element process is. And I'm sure our expert panel can elaborate also.
Yeah, is there, John or Xiomara, is there anything else you'd like to add on there?
I think that was very comprehensive, and we could get into a lot more detail, but despite the level of detail the mayor gave, that was about as concise as you could make it.
Yeah, sounds right.
I agree. That was a really great overview. And I think the only thing I'd add, and I know we're going to dig into this later on, is that this is an exceptionally exciting cycle because there's a lot more teeth to these state laws than there's been in the past. There's a lot more accountability. So it's that much more interesting and that much more important for everyone to be involved with their housing element process this time around.
True, very true. Thank you. So actually, Xiomara, we'll come back to you for a second question. Obviously, one of the things that you have to do to build a lot of housing is to find places to do it. And so what considerations do you take into account, or should cities take into account when choosing locations for housing so that they can best meet their needs?
Yeah, thanks for the question. And when we think about where to build, you can't not think about AFFH, affirmatively further fair housing, which fundamentally means how do we deliver inclusive communities and undo the history of segregation and discrimination that we've done over the past many years. And so that means thinking thoughtfully, for example, looking at high opportunity area neighborhoods and equitably distributing housing throughout our communities. In Alameda, we have an interesting challenge. I think it's an interesting example because in our city charter, we have Article 26, also known as Measure A, an exclusionary zoning ordinance that passed in 1973, and it doesn't allow multifamily development, and it limits the density to 1 unit per 2,000 square feet. So when we think about, our homelessness problem, when we think about affordable housing, we have to think about the feasibility of addressing these needs with multifamily. So in our city charter, we literally have in black and white that no, those people that live in those type of developments aren't allowed in our community. And so what we've done in previous cycles, if we had workarounds, we've worked with the state density bonus, we've had multifamily overlay sites. So on the one hand, this ordinance doesn't have so much bearing because we've been able to have developments over the past few years. But on the other hand, it says so much about us as a community, right? Because it's saying again that we as a city, as an island community, don't have space for more neighbors. And again, this is exclusionary zoning. And I would actually think about it almost as like the deeds of like these old covenants, these racially restrictive covenants that don't allow people of color to own homes. They say that unless you're the help, and back in the day that you couldn't live in those homes. And you have that in black and white. People of color own those homes, but like in their office and their deeds that it says that they can't allow to own those homes. And that's not the case. So practically speaking, that doesn't mean anything, but it's there in black and white. So for the city of Alameda to have that in our zoning code, reflective of what we think about how this community should develop, is something that I do think we have to really be mindful about in our housing element process. I don't think there's room for exclusionary zoning at this point in time. And we have to take advantage of this opportunity to look at our zoning code and see if we could overturn that. And also equitably distribute the housing, not have it all dumped on the west side where there's plenty of land. And of course, like it could support affordable housing, but also on the east side, where it is a more high opportunity resource part of our city, because every neighborhood should be a high opportunity resource neighborhood. And so, yeah, every city should do their fair share, and every community and every neighborhood should do their fair share in every city in the region.
Yeah, I think that obviously sounds right. And Councilmember Wizard, I mean, you as in your role at the lead of the campaign for fair housing elements, you see sort of the full picture across, the Bay Area and the region. What are there sort of best practices or considerations for figuring out where to put new housing that we need?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there's Xiomara is 100% correct that it's not just that we need new housing, but where does it go, and the effects of not being mindful of where it goes. But in a more strict sort of planning or development lens, we know that lower density is economically infeasible when we talk about high opportunity or high resource areas. And so if we're talking about smaller sites, a 1/10 of an acre or 2/10 of an acre, that's a 4,000 square foot or 8,000 square foot lot. Okay, that's not small, but if the zoning is not amended at the same time as saying, yes, we want to put housing on a 4,000 square foot lot, then you'll only get one home out of it. So in places like Sacramento, where downtown they're doing 100 units on a 1/2 acre lot, that's very dense. That's 20,000 square feet, or 5 of those smaller lots I just described, but they're, instead of getting 5 homes, they're getting 20 times that amount. So the zoning goes hand in hand with the type of housing we're trying to build and trying to create. But then, the other side of this coin is, if we're talking about rural communities, and not even suburban, but I mean really a rural community where you're taking a 10-15 minute trip outside sort of the city center, and it's very low density, and there are no services out there. You've got to have a car to get into town. Does it make sense to have 100 apartments? Does it make sense to have 20 apartments? Because if there's no public transit, if there's no jobs, if there's no schools, forcing lower income housing that's more affordable to people with less income mandates people have cars and reduces the walkability and sustainability of that kind of housing development, because you're requiring people to get into a car to get somewhere and not have access to a grocery store or an elementary school or a health clinic or a pharmacy. And so then we've come full circle to the AFFH question and about how we intentionally place housing in places where there is a sufficient level of services, but also good opportunity, and not perpetuating these patterns of exclusionary zoning or ghettoizing our communities by putting all of the low-income housing in one place. And so that is really dependent on sites that are of an adequate size. And the state of California has said that is no less than half an acre and no more than 10 acres. And sites that are near amenities. And that gets into the tax credit allocation committee's TCAC or LIHTC financing, low income housing tax credits. That gets into walk sheds and bike sheds to those services, and whether they're within a half mile of a high quality transit corridor or high frequency transit stop like bus or rail, and VTA and BART and Caltrain. And so we have a lot of complex inputs that direct us towards certain types of housing density and housing typologies with regard to AFFH, sites, amenities, and feasibility for that type of construction.
Got it. And yeah, plenty of things to tug on there. Very complicated. I'm going to circle back to this in a second, but I think one thing that comes up again and again as we discuss housing elements is like, yes, let's build housing. And how do we do that fairly? And we run into this issue and this, several decade long history now of displacement and gentrification across the Bay Area. And so, with this powerful tool of enforceable housing elements, what are those tools and strategies therein that exist to mitigate displacement and gentrification? And so, Mr. Mayor, I will start with you.
Well, excellent question. And I think it's important to put sort of my answer in context, that there was a recent study by the Urban Displacement Project and the Changing Cities Research Lab that looked at 20 years of data in the 9-county San Francisco Bay Area region, and really looked at two questions. One, when new market rate housing is built, what happens to the residents in those areas? And what also happens when jurisdictions adopt tenant protections? And the research found that really building market rate housing does reduce the displacement pressure, because you are building housing for people at various incomes, and that reduces the pressure it creates on existing lower income or moderate income tenants. But as well, that having strong tenant protection policies is also critical to mitigating the impacts of displacement. And so really, there is no one solution to how we address our housing crisis. We really do need an all of the above approach. We do need to build market rate housing. We need to build as much permanently affordable housing as possible. We need to preserve existing housing from to keep it permanently affordable and prevent displacement. And we need robust policies to protect renters as well. So I think a number of things. One, preservation, affordable housing preservation, I think, is a critical tool. That's also a way for some local governments to meet their regional housing need allocation requirements. And this is an area where Berkeley's done quite a bit in recent years. We launched a small sites fund to specifically enable nonprofit builders to buy existing buildings to keep them permanently affordable, particularly in neighborhoods that have seen sort of advanced levels of displacement and gentrification. And we want to grow that fund so that we can keep housing permanently affordable and keep people in their homes, and look at through potential limited equity models to look at creating wealth and long-term stability and affordability. Having things like rent control and inclusionary zoning is also really critical to preventing displacement and providing affordable homes. And then obviously building affordable housing is key. And building affordable housing along with policies like, for example, a local preference policy to give preference to people who were previously living in a particular neighborhood to be able to occupy new deed restricted affordable housing. That's really critical as well. So, I think there are a number of different policy tools that, cities like Berkeley and Oakland and San Francisco have been using in recent years to prevent displacement. But certainly we have a supply problem. We do not have nearly enough housing to address not only the need of people that are currently in the Bay Area, but those that will be coming to the Bay Area. And so we need to address the decades-long shortage of housing. We need to build housing for people all income levels, and we need to have robust tenant protection policies. We need to look at things like an affordable housing overlay to incentivize the production of affordable housing in neighborhoods throughout communities. We need to look at rent control. We need to look at anti-displacement policies and preserving existing housing. I think what it comes down to, and this is at the core of the CASA process, the Committee to House the Bay Area process that ABAG and MTC led several years ago. They really called on us to adopt policies to address the 3 Ps: production of new housing, preservation of existing housing, and protection of existing tenants. And all those things are really critical to having a balanced housing strategy. So while we're building new housing, we can also keep people currently housed, keep people in the communities that they've been living in, and also, preserve our economic and cultural diversity.
Yeah, I appreciate that. John or Xiomara, do either of you want to respond, add on, or share a local experience?
Yeah, I would just add that the mayor has it exactly correct. Those 3 Ps, it's not your option, choose a P. It is the 3 Ps. You're supposed to do all 3 of them simultaneously. Because if you do tons of production but no protection, you'll displace people. And if you do only preservation, we have more people being born than people leaving this floating rock every year. And so we will run out of homes for people, which we have seen as we've stopped producing housing over the last several decades at the rate that we once were. And if you only preserve the housing, you protect the tenants that live there, great tenant protections, but then there's no turnover. And so you just have a constant drain of people who are leaving a community. And then once in a while, there's an opportunity, but you've lost the majority of your up and coming folks, whether that's kids graduating from high school, whether it's new college grads, whether it's people who've accepted a job offer and they have to turn it down because there's nowhere to live. So I can't take that job. I can't commute 2 hours to get to work or live in a hotel for a year, waiting for somebody to leave an apartment. So it's all these things together. And the mayor mentioned a couple of things. You can do right of first return on any developments. You can ratchet up the remuneration, the payout if you buy out an apartment building, and the folks that will become permanently displaced. There's a formula that exists in law, but you can create a local ordinance as a charter city, like many in the Bay Area are. You can create an exaction, and now that does raise the cost of development. So for permanent supportive housing and affordable housing, that has a consequence, and that's something that has to be mitigated through thoughtful local ordinances. But if we're talking about converting a small apartment building into condos, like with the Ellis Act, which is in desperate need of reform, if there's a local ordinance that's not preempted by the Ellis Act, you could create an economic shield for those folks who are being displaced by creating a greater benefit for them as they get pushed out of that apartment, and make it really less worth that developer's while to try to push those folks out somewhere else. So that's creating that protection for those tenants. We all know that just a glut of supply will not fix a problem, because while we can only live in one home at a time, there are people who want to live in desirable places, and they will have a second or a third home and get the Airbnbs and all those sorts of things. So it's not just production. And I don't think any responsible or thoughtful pro-housing or YIMBY policymaker or activist or advocate or thinker is supply only do supply. I don't think that's a thing I've heard really from anybody, because we know that gentrification and displacement exist, and just as much as we want to increase housing supply to increase opportunity, We don't want to stifle opportunity and push people out of their homes and onto the street to steal that opportunity from them and give it to someone else. It's an all of the above approach, like the mayor said.
I think that's exactly right. I just want to maybe take my response in a slightly different direction. Can't underscore how important it is to have an all of the above approach with the 3Ps framework. And I'm excited to see that there's more attention to preservation. I always felt like that was like the ugly cousin or whatever of the 3Ps. Is like, it's always protection, and now there's more attention with preservation. But another way to think about preservation is when it comes to the community involvement, it could be taken in maybe in the not so great direction where we're talking about preserving the character of a community and preserving things as is because we're used to a certain way and not acknowledging that our communities, our region is growing. But there's also needing to respect our culture of a preservation. So when we do think about these historically marginalized communities, how do we take into account the need to preserve their history and involve those voices as we grow as a region, as we grow as a city, as a neighborhood, et cetera. So there is that good type of preservation when it comes to more of that community involvement, and that's going to help when it comes to displacement and gentrification by getting involved in your community in these types of hearings and the housing element process.
Yeah, so I'm curious. I'm going to take us a little bit off road as a bit of a follow up, but we have had. I'm drawing on a couple strings that we've touched on. One is that it was mentioned earlier. This is an exciting time because we have enforceability at the state level. We have strong laws with teeth, and at the same time, we've also we've recently passed laws that allow for things like 2 to 4 to 10 units on a site or a lot division, for example. These are things that are meant to make it easier to build housing. I'm drawing a little bit of inspiration from a question from Jeff Levin, but the idea that we need to build, there's certainly no number of affordable housing units that we could feasibly build that would be too many. I think that's hard to conceive of at the moment. But even though we have these, enforceable laws, if we can only enforce things like 2 to 4 units on a site, that doesn't give us a ton of ability to build affordable housing in exclusionary areas. And so I'm wondering at the city level, what can be done to, push beyond the 2 to 4 units per site? And where are we going to find money to help finance those desperately needed units, given that they may be sitting on more expensive property? Did I make any sense to the panelists?
Yeah, that's a really difficult question. I think it's important to I'll just briefly kind of intro and answer. And I think a model that works is community land trusts, where the value of the land is discounted from the cost of development. But that means somebody is giving that land to the land trust, and that costs money. The cost will be there no matter what. It's a matter of who pays that cost. And certainly it's not the people who have less money and need some support to get into being homeowners, or even creating permanent supportive housing or just deed restricted affordable housing. There is always a cost, no such thing as a free lunch, but how do you take that cost out? And I really think that's where the state is needing to leverage its resources And we've got the Surplus Lands Act to redevelop government-owned parcels. But I think, you know, this is my fanboy plug for Alex Lee. I think this is where social housing fits in. And I think the idea that we have the richest state in the richest country in the history of the world and the state doesn't build any housing for people is a lost opportunity. And even if the state were to operate like a housing authority, as opposed to a socially conscious development agency, that would still be better than what we do now.
Yeah, if I can also add, I agree with Councilmember Wizard that we do need to explore the creation of a state housing finance agency to create housing for very low and even moderate income residents. And you know, for now, I think the burden is on not just private developers, but also on nonprofit developers to be able to produce that affordable housing. But I do think that there's a role the state needs to play. And we also need to pair the creation of an agency with the resources that we know we need to buy and to build new affordable housing. But you know, to your last question, you know, I think several things. You know, cities are now going to have to plan for and build much more affordable housing. And so we need to make sure we provide the resources and the tools for local governments to be able to do that. Something I often hear from my colleagues at the Association of Bay Area Governments. You know, you're requiring us to have to plan for all this housing, but where are the resources? Not just for building the affordable housing, but the transit investments and infrastructure. And so I think it is the responsibility of regional governments to provide those resources. And so one of the things that we're talking right now at ABAG MTC is the creation of our transit-oriented communities policy, which has the potential of incentivizing state and regional transportation dollars for communities that are, I guess, planning for a certain denser housing, making the affordable housing and transit investments so that we can have more transit-rich infill housing throughout our region. And so I think, you know, whether it's through the money that MTC has, whether it's through a potential new regional revenue measure that we are discussing for the 2024 ballot, we need to be able to provide those resources at the regional level, and the state has a role that they have to play as well. And you know, we have an unprecedented budget surplus this year. This is probably the last time we're going to have such a huge surplus, and I really think it's critical that the governor and the legislature really prioritize housing as they are developing the state budget. And so, you know, we've joined many government agencies, nonprofit developers, to call on the governor and the legislature to allocate billions of dollars for housing, not just preserving housing, but building affordable housing, because that's really going to be critical for us to be able to build new housing, preserve existing housing, but also recognize that building market rate housing through inclusionary zoning and through affordable housing fees, that also helps us recapture some of the value of new investment to be able to build affordable housing. And so also, you know, by zoning to accommodate more housing and building more housing, we get the resources to have more affordable housing as well, either in projects or the funds that local governments can use to help fund permanent supportive housing. And then just lastly, on your question on sort of missing middle housing, you know, while SB 9 is now the law in California, and people can do lot splits or build multiple units on lots, you know, we do have to look at, you know, where we can accommodate housing. And while we need to prioritize public land and we need to prioritize building housing on our corridors, around our transit stations, there also is an opportunity and I think a responsibility for us to build housing in our residential neighborhoods to not only increase opportunity, but also to help us meet our state and regional requirements. So, you know, we are looking in Berkeley at not just doing the bare minimum when it comes to SB 9, but looking at doing more than that. And I think you can have more dense housing. If you go through Berkeley's neighborhoods, and I'll stop here, you know, we have a mix of different building topologies. We just don't have single family homes in some of our single family neighborhoods. We have 4-story or 5-story apartment buildings right next to some of those single family homes. And that has allowed more people to live in different parts of our city. And when we continue to have restrictive zoning ordinances that prohibit multifamily housing in some of our single family neighborhoods, we're not just perpetuating exclusion in some of our parts of our city. I'll just note single family zoning started in Berkeley and was actually adopted in order to prevent a dance hall in the exclusive Elmwood district. So that's the foundation of single family zoning in Berkeley, which we are trying to undo that, not just to address decades of racial segregation, but also to expand opportunity and expand housing in our communities. And I think we have an opportunity with our housing elements for other cities to take leadership as well.
Great, really appreciate that. Thank you, Mayor, for the context as well. I'm gonna ask another follow-up question here. That's basically we talk a lot about, you know, sort of creating state agencies or regional agencies to do this work, and I think that can bring up for some folks the idea of redevelopment agencies. And certainly an agency with a bit of a checkered past. But is it, you know, is there a world where something like a redevelopment agency exists that does good work in the Bay Area?
I say yes. I mean, the loss of redevelopment had a big impact on the ability of local governments to build affordable housing. And we've seen abuses like the infamous Mermaid Bar in downtown Sacramento and other use of redevelopment not to prioritize housing. But with the loss of redevelopment, that was a critical tool for us to recapture some of that value that new investment is bringing to our communities to prioritize building housing. And so that's left us with very few tools. And either local governments have to pass bond measures or we have to hopefully rely on any state or federal subsidies. So I hope that in 2 years that we will be in a position to put on the ballot in the 9-county San Francisco Bay Area a regional bond measure to generate billions of dollars to build and preserve affordable housing. And that's not only, those are not only taxes that taxpayers will pay, the private sector, the business sector will pay it also, recognizing that they have a responsibility to address our housing crisis. Because some of the most largest employers in the Bay Area, while we appreciate their presence in our community, have brought thousands and thousands of people to our region, but the communities that they live in have not built the housing. And that has just shifted the burden on San Francisco and on the East Bay and other parts of our region. So we all have a responsibility, the private sector, the public sector, to be able to address this housing crisis. And I do think the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, which we just launched at the regional level, presents an enormous opportunity for us to provide the scale of resources for us to address this problem.
Yeah, I just wanted to double click what the mayor just said. And I was pretty much going to say the exact same thing to the previous question, because all roads seem to lead to the federal government or state government, like with ADU financing, like that's just like slowly becoming more and more of an opportunity, but again, emphasis on the slowly. And since the dissolution of redevelopment agencies in, I don't know what year it was, 2012, we haven't had a consistent source of funding for housing. It's been a lot of one-time one-time funding opportunities, and that leaves cities and jurisdictions in precarious situations after like a few years, not really knowing what's to come next and what to do with the operating costs, et cetera. So this is where we're forced to be innovative, and I do think we are lucky to be in the Bay Area where there is so much innovation. It's like the nature and the dynamics of the region that we live in, where we do have the Bay Area Housing Finance Authority, and hopefully this bond measure in a few years that we could hopefully leverage and take advantage of, but also the dynamics of the relationships with philanthropy and businesses really trying to come together as a unit, as one region to address these various crises. And that doesn't mean that we let up with our advocacy at the federal and state level, but it means like we have to walk and chew gum at the same time and like be innovative at the local and regional level.
Councilmember Wizard?
I would just add quickly that it's impractical and infeasible to ask cities to solve regional and state and federal problems with their budgets. You know, the federal government can print money. That's a good place to start. State governments, you know, just like compounding interest, state governments have more money and can leverage more resources. And so when we talk about a regional problem like dearth of housing, you know, it's not Berkeley's burden to solve housing or Alameda's problem or Piedmont's problem. It's no one city's burden to solve housing for a region, but also each city and the county must participate in that problem solving. And that is why this regionalism approach that you've heard the mayor and Xiomara speak of is critical, because if we're all pitching in together, we can all have a better outcome than any one of us individually, because these are not apples to apples comparisons. It's not, you know, if the per capita revenue in every single city in the Bay Area or even in the East Bay was exactly the same, that would be a different conversation, but that's not how that works. And so with a complex problem, we need complex solutions. If the state isn't going to take on the responsibility of governance, then cities will have to work together to do that. And hopefully that changes rather soon.
That's great. I appreciate that. Before we get into Q&A, and folks, feel free to keep dropping your questions into the chat. Please send them to me. I would really appreciate it. Just before we get to that, 30 seconds or less from each of our panelists. Given all of our challenges, given we've just talked a lot about what we have to do, what is one thing that makes you feel confident we can achieve our goals here?
That's a tough question. I'll try to do my best to answer it in 30 seconds. You know, I think there's an increased recognition that we have a crisis, and that if the status quo is not working, you know, increasing numbers of homeless people living on our streets, people living in vehicles, you know, people being priced out of our region. And so I think that there is a recognition that we have a problem, and I think there's the will to solve that problem. And I really do think that now more than ever. And so I'm hopeful that with the right plans and the right tools and the will, that we can make a difference.
There is, I think, an awareness now, not just in government, but in terms of our public consciousness of the gargantuan challenge we face with our protracted housing problem. And as more people begin to understand, for instance, everybody knows what the PTA is. Young, old, kids or not, everybody has heard about a PTA, but not everybody knows what zoning is. And as we begin to shift toward a new level of public consciousness around zoning and these problems that we've been facing, there is sort of a higher level of understanding of this minute and, you know, parochial portion of city and municipal governance. And I think that the increasing awareness of this problem and the energy people put into saying, how can we fix this? How do we make it better? Is indicative of the progress that we have been making and that we are marching toward better days.
Agreed. There's a lot of momentum and attention in housing, including at the state level, as we talked about, more teeth to these state laws. AFFH has been law since 1968, and now there's more accountability with the Housing Accountability Unit and in the Capitol, and the AG having more authority, the Attorney General having more authority. So just seeing that there is, again, more teeth to the process. And, you know, for me, I love representing the city that I love. I love representing Alameda. But you know, we're in this once in a decade opportunity to really do something with our housing plans. So we're really giving this chance. Like, a lot of eyes are on us, especially at the Capitol level. And we could prove to them that we could be sincere and deliver equitable and compliant housing elements, or we could not. And that is unfortunate for someone like me, where I want to be able to interpret these state laws and apply it to our community in a way that works for us and demonstrate that we are one of many members of the region as a participant addressing our housing crisis. So it's a challenge, but I think it's important to also underscore it is an opportunity for us to address the housing crisis.
Those are great. I appreciate you all giving context there. Going to jump to a couple of questions we've got in the chat. I may editorialize, putting that out there for folks. First question, what are some short-term steps that can be taken at the federal level? Each of you represent local or regional spots. Some of us are running for higher office. What would be your ask of Secretary Fudge in the Biden administration?
Well, a couple of things. One, we need to pass the Build Back Better plan, because in that plan, there is significant resources for affordable housing. And so I think we just need to keep the momentum going to advocate for this important legislation, which it's not only around our economic recovery, but really creates an enormous opportunity to address, you know, inequality and opportunity throughout the United States. Also, Senator Padilla has legislation which he recently introduced to significantly expand funding for affordable housing in the United States. And so I think there are some opportunities that have been proposed in Washington, and we have an administration that supports some of the policies that we talked about, and you know, is willing to dedicate resources to support cities and counties and local governments to be able to build the affordable housing. So I agree with what Councilmember Wizard said. You know, that the federal government has an incredible opportunity to play a leadership role here. Let's recognize that the correlation between increased homelessness and the reductions in our public housing budget is not a surprise. You know, in the late 70s, early 80s, during the Reagan administration, when we saw huge cuts to public housing, we saw the increase in homelessness. So there's a direct correlation with federal investment and our housing affordability crisis.
Yeah, I mean, just for $150 or $200 a month, we saw child poverty get cut, you know, by 100% or 50%, you know, cut in half for, you know, arguably chump change to the federal government. And to think that, you know, we're spending thousands of dollars per person experiencing homelessness a month in fire and emergency response, in the wraparound services through county mental health and you know, public health resources, in policing, that, you know, a lot of us are uncomfortable with the way that we police on this issue, and that we're not instead providing the opportunity for them to obtain housing, which would cost less and then creates follow-on economic benefit through more income going to the person or business that owns that rental, and the person who's now housed having stable housing, and being able to save money, to have disposable income, to go to the grocery store, to go out to eat instead of only having enough money to survive. And as you heard the mayor earlier talk about, new production decreases displacement pressure. If the Housing and Urban Development Department is creating new housing opportunity, we're reducing demand within our communities, which relieves pressure and creates more stability for those who would otherwise be living in precarious situations and relative housing insecurity. All of these things fit together. And the federal government, if they're not going to be building new units, should be, I'd love to see a national zoning framework with almost like a Mullen density with a minimum level of units that are permitted on a lot or per acre or whatever it was, because there are these exclusionary places that say that their entire city is historic, or say that it's a mountain lion habitat, or whatever nonsense they cook up in order to avoid their responsibility of being a regional partner that enjoys the benefits of a regional economy, but pretends like they're not attached to it when it comes time to house the workers.
Yeah, if we could go back just even to spending levels to the 80s and just have that attention back to housing and homelessness, we would be in a much better position. And I looked it up, and an aspect of Senator Padilla's bill would bring a component of his package up to 6,500% of the current, from the present day current investment. And that just shows how much disinvestment there's been over the years on housing and homelessness. So just a refocus on that as a priority would be huge, would make a really big impact. And there's so many different specifics that we could talk about, but the one that is top of mind for me is like universal vouchers, increasing housing choice vouchers is a big one.
Great, that's super helpful. I know we only have a few minutes left here, but I want to address, I almost opened the transportation can of worms, but I think that is for a separate series panel. I do want to say though, I think sometimes we talk a lot about, in the conversation about housing, certainly among advocates, I think sometimes when we hear housing, we think we're saying, or folks think we're saying rental housing. And so in this housing element conversation, I think there's, maybe a misunderstanding or a clarification to make around how are ownership opportunities involved? Pose that to our panelists.
Just by example, the city of San Diego's housing element, LISC San Diego, had proposed a homeownership opportunity zoning scheme whereby they already had a commercial banker, I want to say it's Wells Fargo, Bank of America, that was willing to loan them or give them access to $20 million to build duplexes in high opportunity areas because they had done the pro forma. They knew it would work out in a financial sense, it would be feasible to build them, and that LISC would be the builder and the property management company to facilitate these tenants in common, where two people owned a duplex, two households owned a duplex on a single lot in the city of San Diego. So we can talk about affordable home ownership, and we can do affordable home ownership, but it's incumbent upon our cities to create the policy framework to implement it. And unfortunately, that was not a strategy that the city of San Diego wanted to pursue in their housing element, but that exists. We know how to do that. We have the tools, and we have the investment opportunities to create that kind of housing.
Yeah, I'll just add, with the passage of SB 9, I think that creates real opportunities for us through lot splits, through subdivisions, to build, townhomes or accessory dwelling units that are going to be much more affordable than buying an existing home. And I do think that cities do need to look at missing middle policies as a way to, and what I mean by missing middle policies is missing middle is a kind of a typology of housing, but building 2 to 4 unit projects in residential neighborhoods, because that's going to increase opportunity for entry-level homeownership for individuals, families. And so I think that being part of a housing element plan, I think is really important. In addition to some of the ideas that Councilmember Wizard talked about, really looking at how you pair, community reinvestment requirements with specific housing policies.
Right, I think we had it. All right, well, thank you. I think that's it. We're certainly out of time. Folks, really appreciate you all showing up. To our panelists, again, cannot thank you enough for taking the time out of all of your very busy schedules to be a part of this panel and to help us as young Dems educate folks. I will say, I think if there are ways to get involved, we will follow up with those in an email. I think going to the Campaign for a Fair Housing Element website is probably a really strong first step. Councilmember Wizard, I think you would endorse that position as well. But yeah, again, I will just say thank you all for taking the time. Really appreciate you. And if you are between 14 and 35 years old, I highly recommend and welcome you to become an East Bay Young Democrat. You know, if you do, you may be the mayor of Berkeley before you know it. And I think that would be very cool for all of us. Yeah, like I said, we will follow up with all of you information about our next panel in our housing series, and looking forward to seeing all of you hopefully in person before too long. Appreciate it. Have a good night, everyone.